Hi, I'm here to talk with you about Jonathan Edwards, The Great Awakening, and Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But before we get that conversation started, I'd actually like you to take a minute on your own and read the bottom of page 345 that gives you a brief introduction into the text. And then on page 346, take a look at that cool image that's actually of the first printed version of the sermon. So take a few minutes to do that and then come back, because I want to move on to sharing with you a little more information about the cultural context. But I'm going to assume you've already read that little snippet there. All right, see you in a couple seconds. Woohoo! You came back. So what the intro doesn't really reveal to you is that Edwards was involved in a major theological religious argument that was going on in America, and in particularly in New England, between a traditional idea of how conversion works in Calvinist Protestantism, which is what Puritanism was, and a new evangelical model of how conversion worked. So in the traditional model, which, by the way, Edwards was educated and trained within, the idea of a Puritan minister was that a soul could be converted to God through Christ in a process of self-examination and in a way, introversion, moving into the self and examining, scrutinizing your every action and thought and trying to explore the relationship between that and your standing with God. We've talked about this Puritan quest for assurance, Puritan quest for salvation, which is really a quest for signs of God's grace, signs that you are of the elect in your heart, soul, mind, and external life. So this, for the traditional Puritan model, was a very structured process that involved a careful public confession or conversion narrative that was given before your peers in the church. There were even sort of models of steps and stages which people were supposed to follow, which you can find out more about in Donna Campbell's web lecture about Puritan sermons and conversion narratives. But the whole idea was that it was an extended process to discover your relationship with God. And it involves a sustained participation in a church community, in Bible study, guided by a priest who was a scholar and an expert of the Bible and Calvinistic religious theory and principle. So that was the mode that dominated Puritanism from the 1630s in America until really about 100 years, until around 1730 and 1740, where we start to see this questioning of that. And this questioning manifests itself in what we call an evangelical movement. And you're all probably familiar with that word evangelical because we have strong movements of evangelical Christianity in America, in Southern California, and San Diego County, right, to this day. So evangelicism really emerges in the American middle states, which are now, some of which, like Georgia, are southern, and New England in the mid-18th century in what's called the Great Awakening. And so while the Great Awakening is this spiritual revival marked by these mass outdoor meetings and ecstatic experiences and performances, it also was a fundamental argument about how one discovers, articulates, and explores her or his relationship with God. And so Edwards, although he grows up in this traditional idea of scholarly conversion, and himself is the most scholarly of Puritan ministers, actually embraces evangelical ideas of conversion. And the core of the evangelical model is the born-again experience. And the born-again experience is an instantaneous, epiphanous, emotional, psychological outburst of ecstatic revelation of your relationship with God. And that was not a traditional Puritan model. And it got Edwards into some trouble, and it alienated him from a lot of his colleagues in New England, but it did also situate him as a leading voice in a new movement. Didn't always work out well because Edwards, as we know from the introduction, was actually a low-key guy. And most of the evangelical Great Awakening ministers were great performers. They were masters of dramatic proclamation and stirring up the emotional energy of their audience. They were charismatic speakers. And so we have this difference, this juxtaposition of the sort of scholarly Bible tradition, church community-based conversion process that had prevailed for 100 years in New England with this new, tumultuous, evangelical, passionate, dramatic, psychological, emotional moments of catharsis led by these ministers who were not following formal Puritan sermon logic and instead were sort of emoting and catalyzing and galvanizing. I certainly don't want to sound like I'm evaluating one style over the other, but Edwards, in his own kind of way, was at once a cutting-edge leader of the evangelical movement, but also himself a devout scholar. So this radically evangelical sermon, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God, is written in traditional scholarly Puritan sermonic form. So that's a really interesting thing about the context of Edwards' work, that he's participating in this larger religious theological shift in American culture. Still plays out today. Okay, in a few minutes I'm going to ask you to look at just the first 2 pages of the sermon. And as you do that, I'd like you to almost think about the ways that, actually think about the ways that Edwards almost is engaged in like a literary analysis of the line from the Bible that he starts off with. He starts off quoting a line from Deuteronomy. And that line from the Bible, he then unpacks for like a page and a half, almost as if he's writing a paper for this class, because I'm going to argue that he gets into all sorts of analysis of connotation and symbolism, especially of this idea of the foot sliding, and foot sliding as a metaphor for all sorts of moral, ethical questions, challenges, behaviors. To me, it's really fascinating example of what I really would call just as much a literary as biblical analysis of this line from Deuteronomy. And the Puritans did this all the time. They were masters of allegorical and symbolic readings of their own lives and the relationship between their own lives and biblical stories. So I want you to go ahead and take a couple minutes to read those 2 pages on your own, do some circling, do some annotation, do some highlighting, and then I'm going to come back. Then you'll come back and I'll give you some ideas about the next section of the sermon to look at. See you in a few seconds. Yeah, you're back. All right, we want to look at the next section of the sermon, which is called Doctrine. And this is where Edwards lays out the theological principles that he's going to build his argument around. But what's interesting here is how profoundly literary Edwards' language is. And I think all Puritan ministers were capable of this kind of symbolic, connotative rhetoric. But I think Edwards' evangelical position and the appeals he wants to make to psychology and emotion make his sermon particularly vibrant in terms of its use of literary devices. And it's all about establishing the principle of God's sovereignty. Now remember, Edwards isn't against the human intellect. I mean, he's a great scholar himself. Arguably, he and Franklin are the greatest American scholars up to the American Revolution. And yet, for Edwards, the intellect is always secondary to faith and revelation. The intellect is always secondary, and the human intellect is secondary to faith and revelation, secondary to God's will because it's a creation of God in his Puritan paradigm of God's sovereignty. And so what Edwards is calling for is total submission to God's will as the only way you can encounter grace and be granted grace and be saved from the eternal damnation he describes so vigorously. So as you read through these 4 pages, you'll almost find that every paragraph or every couple lines, there's a new trope, there's a new image, there's a new metaphor or simile that's invoked to talk either about God's wrath and power, the nature of the devil and hell, or the sinful status of what he calls natural men, people who haven't been born again, or the unconverted, or the souls of the wicked. So I want you really looking for the particular the metaphors, the symbols, but also the imagery and the appeals to sense and emotion that are powerful tools in a part of the sermon that is relatively theological and abstract in nature, but putting these evangelical perspective in it changes how Edwards uses this. So take a few minutes to read those pages, and when you're done with those pages, when you get to page 351, you get about, halfway through the page, you're going to see at the bottom a section called Application. Stop there and come back to the video. Promise? You promise you come back to the video? You sure? All right. Hey, you're here. Okay. So for Edwards, the doctrine is the theory behind things. The application is where he's going to do something with this information through his sermon with his audience. And he tells us right under the header application, he says, the use may be of awakening to unconverted persons in this congregation. So that's his purpose now. His mission is to take these ideas he's laid out in the doctrine and use those to try to convert those who have not been born again. Now, this is important. Edwards is not trying to convert his audience to Christianity. They're already Christians. They're already Puritans. They already have a religious allegiance, alliance, membership. But within Puritanism, there's this divide over, as I said before, the traditional model of conversion and this evangelical model. And so what Edwards is saying is, look, I think I can use what I've laid out here to convince those of you who are among the unconverted to embrace God, in particular Jesus Christ, and be born again. So I want you, as you read this longest part of the sermon, 7 pages, and it can be dense, to really look for the ways that Edwards uses literary devices as part of that argument. So he's got rationales and reasons, but it's the devices that jump out at me. For example, 2 different references to spiders. We're going to hear about swords. We're going to hear about rivers and floods. There's all sorts of stuff going on. Take a look in particular on 53, 56, and 57. One of my favorite lines from Edwards happens on those pages, where he says, at one point he's taking a pause to his audience and he's sort of looking out at them and saying, and look around you. We don't even know how many in this room are going to burn in hell. And he says this, I love this line. He says, how many here will remember this discourse in hell? In other words, how many of you who are sitting, listening to this sermon will someday remember it while you're burning in hell? Talk about an awesome rhetorical question, right? It's just amazing. So there's all sorts of great moves and references like that you want to look for as you read through this text. But the pivot moment, the key point in this section comes relatively near the end, when basically Edwards declares Christ has flung the door of mercy wide open. In other words, to his audience, he's saying, this is your moment. This is your opportunity to respond to Christ's call, convert, and again, by convert, he means be born again and be saved. So all of this rhetoric of hell and damnation and burning and eternal suffering, all of this could be seen as an example of tough love, right? I'm going to scare the bejeebies out of you because I want you to accept Christ's invitation to conversion. It's a powerful move at the end, and I think is a good example of why Edwards would talk about this sermon, despite its famous flame-throwing. Edwards would see this sermon as an act of love. And I think that's very intriguing, because in many ways, this idea of the Puritans and their ministers as these cold, morally strict people obsessed with deviant human behavior is really at odds with what's happening here. This is a man who has a fervent relationship with God. We've heard about it in his personal narrative. It's passionate, it's sweet, it's intimate. And here he is presenting God as this unholy terror. Well, I guess holy terror. And really trying to scare his audience, terrify them, so to open them to conversion, to an evangelical, spontaneous, powerful, emotional, psychological, instantaneous conversion. That's a fascinating move in American culture that's going to resonate in all sorts of ways, and it just adds to the complexity of this fascinating American writer and thinker. Hope this helps you manage a difficult text. Hope you take it in pieces. Hope you go back and look at it again if you need it. And I hope I see you in Canvas. Bye.